Gracious Lord, we pray for the blessing of your Holy Spirit this day. Grant that we may know your word. Grant that we may rightly apply it to our world today and to our own lives. For Jesus' sake, amen. All right. So to start with, I did a little reading, as did Jim, on the origin of the Pharisees. From Roger's question last week, where did the Pharisees come from? And it's actually kind of a nebulous thing. There does not seem to, from my limited research, there doesn't seem to be a thing that exactly started the Pharisees off, and it seems to have happened kind of in the intertestamental period between the fall of the first temple and the period of the minor prophets to the coming of Christ. So, from what I read, it sounds like the first actual reference to Pharisees being a thing is like 2nd century BC. First is late first, early 2nd century BC. But frequent references to, but there was something like them before that. So it is very much a nebulous thing, and there isn't a command of God for Pharisees. They just seem to have arisen out of the rebuilding of the temple period and the need for theological education for the people. So that's kind of the best I could come up with for where the Pharisees came from. So, what replaced the Pharisees? Actually, when the temple falls again for the second time in 70 A.D., then both the main controlling religious groups for the Jews, one was the Pharisees, who were the teachers of the common people, and by and large, the common people liked the Pharisees. And then there were the Sadducees, who were essentially the rich upper echelon of society that nobody liked. The Sadducees were the greater heretics. The Pharisees, their teaching wasn't terrible, but it was very law-centered, and of course rejected Christ, so it was terrible from that perspective. But both of those groups kind of come to an end with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD by the Romans. Then the religious life of the Jews ends for a long time at that point. So the Sadducees cease to exist completely. The Pharisees still exist in the synagogues and such in surrounding towns, but their power base in Jerusalem is destroyed. So they have a kind of a brief shining moment in history from the 200 BCs through about 100 AD, and then their influence is gone, and the age of the Pharisees is then replaced by the age of the rabbis. And then you start getting rabbinical literature and rabbinical teaching, and the rabbis are more, Jewish pastors, I guess, for lack of a better word. They aren't really necessarily considered to be theological, the theological educators, the academics. They're more just servants, although there are certain Pharisees who write who are academics, or certain rabbis, excuse me. All right. This morning, I want to start with something different. We're going to start, first of all, I'll give a recap. We're going to get into chapter 24 of Matthew, and this is one of perhaps the most misunderstood, misquoted, miswritten about sections of Matthew's gospel anywhere. This is the chapter that the millennialist sees onto for evidence of Christ's millennial kingdom. This is books have been written on this. The earliest I can think of one called The Late Great Planet Earth. I think it was Hal Lindsey in the 70s wrote a book on the apocalypse, the end of the world, citing Matthew throughout. So it's important to understand what's happening here in this chapter in Matthew, because it will shape how we hear all of these doom and gloom apocalyptic things that are floating around in the world today. So a recap, first of all, on the Matthew 24 handout, a few asterisks to discuss. First, Jesus has finished his woe statements against the Pharisees and religious leaders. Chapter 23 had what we'd call 7 woe statements. Jesus essentially calling the Pharisees out by name in the temple in front of the people and saying, "Woe to you, Pharisees," and then calling them hypocrites, blind guides, whitewashed tombs. He really lays into them. And this is in the days just preceding his crucifixion. So this is his final, maybe 3 days left. And he goes after the Pharisees and scribes. So he finishes those woe statements in 24. While he's in the temple, second asterisk, his woes accuse them of all the following: burdening the common people with laws they themselves did not follow, self-aggrandizement, shutting people out of heaven, taking advantage of people for financial gain, turning people into zealots for their legalism, encouraging false oaths, focusing on minor issues like tithing while ignoring greater teachings on justice, mercy, and faith, being full of hypocrisy, lawlessness, continuing the spirit of hate against God that murdered the ancient prophets. So he really calls them out. All this happened to the face of the Pharisees and the scribes in the temple in front of large crowds. So he publicly humiliates them. And they are mad. And I think, frankly, this is the final straw that breaks the back that leads to his crucifixion. I think had Jesus not publicly shamed the Pharisees this badly, they wouldn't have acted so quickly against him. But they want to kill him now. And within 3 days, they do. So this is really the final push over the edge of the cliff for them. All right. Now, verse 1 and 2, Matthew 24. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. So you see this happen in the temple. And his disciples came to him and showed him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." All right, so they walk out of the temple, and the disciples marvel at the construction of the temple. Now, note this is the second temple. The first temple was built by Solomon after the reign of David, according to God's specifications. It wasn't Solomon's creativity. It was God's design, what the original temple looked like. And it was ornate, and it was gold covered, and it was gorgeous. That temple was destroyed when the northern and southern kingdoms both fell and the Babylonian captivity began. Again, trying to think of the date when that was in my head. I can't say for sure. 700s BC. Maybe it was earlier than that. I should know that. But that was the first temple. When the Israelites came back after the Babylonian captivity, they started rebuilding the temple again. It seems that for hundreds of years they're building the temple and it doesn't get finished. Herod comes along, the Herodian dynasty, in the 30 BCs maybe they start, the original Herod the Great. Maybe it's later than that. But in this ballpark right before Christ. And he decides to finish the temple, the second temple. So the second temple is also called the Herodian temple. And he spends massive amounts of money, engages workers, gets the thing done. Finally, in 64 AD. So the Herodian dynasty finishes it. It takes them like 70 plus years of building, but they finally finish the thing. 64 AD, Romans destroy it in 70. It's only there for 6 years done before it gets razed to the ground. But of course, the Herodian temple, as glorious as it was, wasn't the original design. It was close. It had a lot of the common elements of the first. There was a holy place, a holy of holies. You know, I don't think all of the gold that was part of the first temple was part of the second. There was a lot of gold in it, though. But something of the divine blueprint was no longer there. But it was the center of Israel's religious worship, of course. So you've got that temple built by Herod at the center of Jerusalem, at the center of Israel's worship life. And they come out of the temple here, verses 1 and 2. The disciples are in awe of the thing. And it truly was impressive, even though it wasn't God's original design. Huge stones, evidently, brought in. Ornate construction. The original temple doors, I think, were covered in gold. I don't know that the second temple doors were. They might have been. But a lot of gold, just massive, massive architecture. And supposedly the entire temple complex and everything rises up about 150 feet. So this is like the greatest skyscraper in the entire country. So there was something to marvel at. They come out amazed at the architectural beauty of it all. And then Jesus tells them, yeah, you see all this? Not one stone's going to be left sitting on another. From there, I want to go to the addendum and talk about what Jesus is actually referencing. Because if we're going to understand the rest of what Jesus says to the disciples, you got to understand what actually happens. Okay, and this is where it gets mixed up for the millennialists. They are constantly confusing, and to their excuse, it is confusing. But they are constantly mixing images of the fall of Jerusalem with their view of what the end of the world is going to look like. And it's intentional in the text, in fact, that these two are kind of mixed, but they don't seem to get at all that this is talking about the fall of Jerusalem. They focus exclusively on this is the end of the world Jesus is describing, and it's not. When you know what the fall of Jerusalem actually was like, you get what Jesus was saying. So I want to read through what the fall of Jerusalem was actually like. And I don't want to read through all of it because it is lengthy. But it is important to know what happened. I'm just going to summarize a little bit on the first page. So the first page talks about the rise of the Zealots. The Zealots were a Jewish sect of radicals. They were essentially, Islam in a Jewish body. They were violent. They felt that Rome needed to be driven out of Jerusalem through violence. And they were, the word assassin, it is argued, has roots in the Jewish zealots. They ran around with knives killing people. They assassinated political leaders. They were bad guys. Peter originally was a zealot. Why is Peter always sticking his foot in his mouth? Why in the Garden of Gethsemane when Malchus is standing there and Peter pulls out his sword and cuts his ear off? Why does Peter do that? Because he's a zealot. It's in his spirit to go to war. So Peter is always fighting that inner urge of his. But anyway, the Zealots really created the fall of Jerusalem in the way they dealt with Rome. Rome was the superpower. You didn't mess with Rome, especially at this point in history. The fall of Rome doesn't happen until the 400s. Prior to that, especially in the 100s, they were it. And the Jews thought they could go against them. They did pretty well, surprisingly. So what happens is, in Caesarea, in 66 AD, there was a Jewish synagogue, and the Gentiles came in and profaned it. They, especially, evidently one person, defecated in it and performed rituals to a false god within it. It made the zealots go nuts and started a conflict in Caesarea between the Jews and the Gentiles. Well, the Gentiles were Romans. At this time, instead of the Roman leaders deciding that to calm things down, a Roman leader in particular, a guy by the name of, I've got his name there, Florus, Gasius Florus, decides he's going to go to Jerusalem and tax them. He's going to punish them for their behavior and tax them heavily. While there, a bunch of Jewish youths ran around Jerusalem making fun of him, going around begging pennies from people to give to Rome because the people were poor, and now this Rome's coming in and is going to steal everything they have. So they were mocking the Romans. This florist guy got wind of that, and again, rather than calm the situation down, he goes in and commands his troops just to indiscriminately start slaughtering people. We're going to teach him not to mock us. So he does. And that blows Jerusalem up. And the zealots come forward and attack the Romans. And this says something about the viciousness of the zealots. They actually drove them off. They drove them back to Rome for 4 years. They stayed away. And for 4 years, and not only drove them off, slaughtered a bunch of Romans and took their siege equipment, some their cutting edge weaponry, took it back to Jerusalem and made Jerusalem a fortress with it. And Rome couldn't have that. So Rome sent the armies. The zealots at one point even took control of the temple itself, which was high heresy. They had no business in the temple. So Rome sends the armies. Page 2 then of the handout, and I do want to read some of this. Again, before too much, Israel had 3 main generals in Jerusalem. The city was divided into 3 basic parts: the northern part, the southern part, and the temple part. Each general took a part to defend. And the Jews were warring among themselves too. They couldn't get along. And so at one point in time, one of the guys defending one of the outer parts attacked the guy who was defending the temple part. While Rome is coming at them, they're literally fighting and killing each other. And in the process of that, burned each other's food supplies, which is genius right before a Roman siege is set up to cut off their food supply. So they just went out of their way to ruin themselves. All right. Now to the siege, page 2. Waiting for the Romans in Jerusalem were 23,000 troops. The vanguard of Titus's army cut off that's the Roman general Titus, cut off communications between Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside upon their arrival in April. Titus cleverly added to the confusion within Jerusalem by allowing pilgrims to enter and celebrate the Passover. He had no intention of allowing them to depart, though. He knew that the presence of large numbers of non-combatants would strain the city's food resources. As expected, famine quickly set in. So this is at Passover time. All Jews come to Jerusalem for Passover. Some estimates place the number at this point in time as high as 3 million Jews were in Jerusalem. Titus lets them all go in. And once they're in there, doesn't let any of them out. So the fall of Jerusalem took a major hit, not just from the Jews in Jerusalem. All faithful Jews, they were massacred, their numbers, throughout the country because they were all there for the Passover. Titus reconnoitered the city and decided to begin his assault on the level ground outside the new town. The Romans punched through the outer wall and the inner wall in just 24 days of fighting. They used bronze-headed battering rams to crack the walls. Roman catapults hurled stones into the center of the city to destroy defenses and inflict casualties. Already Jerusalem is starting to come down. It's a 3-ringed city, and they're knocking down, there's the outer walls, the inner walls around the city, and then the walls around the temple complex. So they've taken down 2 walls already in one part of the city with bronze-headed battering rams. And then these catapults, destroying all of the buildings, indiscriminately killing civilians. The Roman commander decided it would be advantageous to tighten his blockade on the city. Titus therefore ordered his troops to construct an encircling line around the city to ensure that the Jews could not smuggle in supplies. The circumvallation line was 4.5 miles long and was strengthened at interval 13 forts. In addition, he issued orders that anyone found outside the city was to be crucified. Pitiful was the fare and lamentable the spectacle. The stronger taking more than their share, the weak whimpering, wrote Josephus. Now, Josephus, in 66, when this first Jewish revolt thing happened and the Jews chased the Romans out of Jerusalem, Josephus was a military commander for the Jews. He was captured by the Romans and basically abandoned his Judaism so that he could stay alive. He cut a deal with the Romans, and he ceased being a general for the Jews. The Romans let him live, and he became a historian for the Jews, wrote a lot of stuff, the history of the Jews in the first century. So he became an author. And a lot of what we know about what happened in the first century in secular Judaism is because of Josephus. But he's considered a traitor by the Jews for good reason. Wives would snatch the food from their husbands, children from fathers, and most pitiable of all, mothers from the very mouths of their infants. Deserters who were allowed out of the city told of corpses everywhere, stacked up and left unburied. So crazed with hunger were the defenders that they resorted to eating leather belts and harnesses. Josephus himself appealed to the combatants to give up, at least for the sake of starving, but he was ignored. Sensing victory was near, Titus pressed the siege of the Temple Mount. Each day he sent legionnaires forward to ram and batter the walls, but the walls were too well made and the individual blocks too thick, so that even prying a handful of them free did nothing to the walls' overall integrity. Frustrated, Titus ordered that the Temple Mount be stormed, but this only led to more lives lost, more standards captured by the enemy. So the Jews were putting up a great fight, killing lots of Romans, making the Romans madder every day. The longer this thing went on, the madder the Romans got, the more vindictive against the Jews they became. The Jews, let's see, the temple, did I read that? No. The Temple Mount and inner courtyard were surrounded by thick walls and a handful of strong towers. The temple alone soared 150 feet into the air. The entire complex, known as the Platform Mount, was itself built atop a dais. The series of walls, boundaries, balustrades, gates, and impediments were meant to halt one's progression toward the earthly home of the Jewish God behind the golden gates. It was within sight of these gates that the remnants of the starving Jewish forces made their last stand. The Jews sallied forth on August 9th and attacked the Romans holding the outer court. For 3 hours, as a seesaw fighting in which the Jews bore the brunt of the Roman cavalry charge, the Jews retreated to the inner court once again. The following day, the Jews attacked the Romans in the outer court again. Now, these are the courtyards of the temple, so they're within the temple. The courtyards are where Jesus was confronting the Pharisees and the scribes. This is where the common people gathered. So they're in those courtyards fighting. The following day, Jews attacked the Romans in the outer court again, but found themselves trapped against the northern wall of the Platform Mount. Someone hurled a flame torch over the wall into the sanctuary surrounding the temple. No one knows who did or why. Which means the temple is now on fire. Any wood stuff in the temple went up. There's no pity for age, no regard for rank. Little children and old men, laymen and priests alike were butchered, wrote Josephus. He added, the cries from the hill were answered from the crowded streets, and now many who were wasted with hunger and beyond speech found strength to moan and wail when they saw the sanctuary in flames. This is essentially hell on earth, right? The temple, the temple and the rest of the city, for that matter, is now smoldering. The temple just plain up in flames, the center of the city. People literally being slaughtered so that the historical recounts are the horses were slipping on the stone because of all of the blood. A river of blood coming down the steps from the Temple Mount. Bodies, severed body parts everywhere, because these are these are essentially axe wars and knife wars, with swords. Vicious, just starving people, the stench of decay, hell on earth. Titus took home to Rome as trophies of his victory the golden table of showbread, the 7-branched candlestick, and a roll of the law. Shortly after Titus' death in AD 81, his brother Domitian had the Arch of Titus erected on the Via Sacra in Rome. In one of the reliefs depicting the destruction of Jerusalem, Roman soldiers are seen carrying off the 7-branched menorah and trumpets, holding them high over their heads. You can see a picture of this on the next page. That's a picture that Titus's brother had commissioned to honor the fall of Jerusalem. The Romans forbade the Jews from rebuilding the temple, established a permanent garrison, and abolished the Sanhedrin, replacing it with a Roman procurators, oh boy, that's a word, court. Why do the Jews still not have a temple? Because the Romans wouldn't let them. And not only that, the Romans wouldn't let any Jews back into Jerusalem. The Romans passed a law that only Gentiles could live in Jerusalem. So literally for hundreds of years, there wasn't any Jews in Jerusalem. It was owned by the pagans. And the nation of Israel, doesn't establish itself again as a nation until, when was it, 1967? It's very recent. So this was the end of the Jewish nation for going on 2,000 years. That was that severe a hit on them. Other sources, and again, just different accounts. Some Jews deserted to the Romans and were released into the country to start new lives. Some of these swallowed gold so they could retrieve it later after nature had taken its course. If any of the zealots found anyone they thought was deserting, they cut their throats. So you've got Jews killing Jews, you've got Romans killing Jews. You've got, word gets out among the Romans that some of these Jews have gold in their stomach. Because, what are you going to do with it if you want to keep it? So what did they do? They gutted them. They gutted them looking for the gold. Often rich people were killed with this excuse and their wealth taken. With the refusal of peace, the siege carried on, the misery grew worse. Families sold all they had and fought each other for food. Robbers broke into private houses and stole food from people. If they found some, they tortured people to make them disclose where they had hidden any food that they had. Some people would creep over the walls at night to gather herbs and plants to eat. These were taken as they returned to the city. The dead bodies were thrown over the walls. Titus saw this and groaned. Even the Roman general was groaning at the horrific sight of this all. Wanting to relieve some of the miseries, he renewed his attacks and made new banks, bringing in wood from 11 miles away. These were made stronger and more powerful than before. The miseries grew worse when deserters fled the city and were caught by the Syrian and Arabian troops and were cut open to see if they had any gold in them. In one night, 2,000 such persons were killed. Titus tried to stop it, but was unable to do so. At this time, thousands of dead bodies were thrown out of the city, and people were searching the common sewers and cattle hills to eat any dung they could find. As the Romans entered the upper city, the Jews fled in fear. The Romans killed everyone in sight. They burst into houses, but left them because of the foul stench of the dead in them. Then they set the city on fire. Josephus says there was so much blood that in places fires were quenched. The Romans grew tired of killing, so they killed only those in arms, the aged, the infirm, and they shut others up in the court of women. Those in flowering years were sent to Egyptian mines or sent to Rome, to the theaters to be killed by sword or beast, and those under 17 were sent for slavery. 97,000 captives, 1.1 million killed, most of them not citizens of Jerusalem. See, these are the other Jews coming in for Passover, but were there for the feast of Passover. There may have been up to 3 million people in the city at the start of the war. The Romans searched the caverns and killed those they found. They broke down walls of the city. This is what it was like. And I think it's in the next paragraphs where it says that the forests around Jerusalem disappeared because the Romans cut down the trees to make crosses to crucify all the Jews who were escaping Jerusalem. So not only do you have the sight of the horror within Jerusalem, but surrounding Jerusalem, the hills are literally covered in crosses of crucified Jews. This scene truly was a horror unlike Rome had unleashed on anybody else. This was a vision of hell. So understand that. And now let's go back to Matthew. First of all, any questions, any comments, any thoughts on that? Okay. The stuff that Jesus is going to talk about in Matthew 24, that the millennialists, yes, try to apply to the second coming of Jesus and the apocalypse, is a description of what's going to happen in just 30-something years right there in Jerusalem. All right, so to start with, not one stone will be left upon another in the temple. Is it on the handout? I lost my handout. What in the world did I do with it? There it is. Yeah, I think it's on the handout. We talk a little bit about a short version of the destruction of Jerusalem. All the gold and stuff that was in the temple, when the temple started on fire, this was a hot fire. The gold melted supposedly and ran down between the rocks and the stones in the temple area. And so the Romans going in wanting the gold dug up all the stones to get it. So they didn't just burn the temple down, they dug it up. There was nothing left. The only thing left of the temple is what's today known as the Wailing Wall. It's just one portion of one wall. And the Jews go there to cry. All right. On the handout now, the thrown down, when Jesus says the rocks will be thrown, there will not be one stone upon another stone which is not thoroughly destroyed. The word that your New King James Version says, that shall not be thrown down. The actual word is kataluo, to destroy, dissolve, overthrow, abolish, a compound word from against or throughout, and luo, to release or break or destroy. So thoroughly destroyed. Not just thrown down, thoroughly destroyed. Everything about that temple is going to be wiped out. All right. Yeah, so the last asterisk, turn to page 2. We won't reread what we just went through. The first asterisk after that account, just imagine the pain of Jesus at this point. He is not just focused on what's lying in his path with his imminent crucifixion within a few days, which he knows is coming. But he can see, because he's God, he can see what's going to happen to all of these Jewish faces when he walks by them in Jerusalem. That one starves to death. This one gets butchered. He knows it all. He sees what's going to happen to the city. The pain he feels for the people has got to be overwhelming, knowing everything that's going to happen to all of these. So when where was that? Where he goes, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that was at the end of, verse 37, the end of chapter 23. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your chicks together as a hen gathers, or gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. See, his compassion for them is born out of this horrible scene he knows is coming on them. And the pain he's carrying has got to be immense. Verse 3 now, Matthew 24. The disciples asked 2 questions. Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So the disciples, two questions. When are these things going to be? That is, when is the temple going to be destroyed? Not one stone left on another stone. When's that going to happen? And two, what's the sign of your second coming? So it's the disciples themselves who seem to join these two things together in their mind. And you know, what prompted them to do so? I think they just assumed the temple was going to last until the end of time. They had no concept of the fact that in 30 years that whole thing was going to be leveled. They weren't thinking in those terms. So they were just thinking the temple is a permanent structure, so if one stone's not going to be left on another, that's got to be the end of the age he's talking about. So they combined these two issues in these two questions. Jesus will now answer each question in turn. It also seems, as Jesus' answer unfolds, that the disciples were not completely wrong in connecting the fall of Jerusalem with the second coming. That is, the former becomes a type for the latter. And description of the two events in time seem to flow together. So, yes, even though we're talking about two very separate events, what happens in Jerusalem does, in fact, become a type, a symbol for the second coming. When the judgment and terror among those who have rejected Christ will be everything and more of what happened in Jerusalem. But they are separate issues. So starting off verses 4 to 8. Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of sorrows." All right, so he starts off, take heed nobody deceives you. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived at what? Don't be deceived that the end is coming, the second coming, that he's arrived. Don't be deceived at that. Because all this other stuff is going to be happening all the time. He talks about, let's see, many sorrows. Where was see that you know trouble? All these things must come. Kingdom against kingdom, pestilence. Beginning of sorrows. Okay, end of verse 8. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. The word sorrows in New King James is actually the word for childbirth in Greek. Intense suffering, and yet it's an interesting choice of words, isn't it? Birth pains. Because, yeah, it's horrible in the minute, and yet it's giving birth to something wonderful, life. The destruction of Jerusalem wasn't the end. It turns out it was a beginning. Because now Christianity really takes off. The pressure from the Pharisees and Sadducees that was so horrendous against the apostles is gone. Christians still have pressures, but now their pressures start coming more from Rome than from the Jews. So the word birth pains is a loaded word that Jesus uses. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. He sees the greater good in the spread of the church and the salvation of the nations coming through this. So it's very revealing language. These verses address what will be going on in the world prior to the temple's destruction. In fact, there is not an age that you can point to where this stuff wasn't happening. Every time a war breaks out, you get some whack job quoting the Bible saying, well, wars and rumors of wars, this must be it, the end is coming. I don't know of a time in history when there hasn't been wars and rumors of wars, or pestilences, or any of these things, earthquakes. Every point in history from the time Jesus said it until now has gone through this. And Jesus is saying flat out, don't be deceived when you see this stuff. It's not the end. This is just the beginning. So this is the normal way the world works. All these guys who every time this happens say, oh, this is the end. Jesus specifically says, don't be deceived into thinking this is the end. Because you're not going to know when the end comes. It's going to come like that. There's not going to be a bunch of signs and you're going to say, oh, well, it's about to happen. All right, thoughts or comments there before we look at the next verses?
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
This happened 30 years after Christ's death?
Yeah, 30, anywhere from, we don't know exactly, but anywhere from 35 to 40 years.
Having taken place during Passover, why all the Jews were supposed to come back? Christ married all the other disciples that weren't dead already. Weren't they? Should have came back for that.
Well, at this 70 AD, yeah, a lot of them were dead already. John was still alive. The Christians were separating themselves a bit from the Jews. And I'm sure there were some Christians who were there at the time. But the Jewish customs, practices, religious worships, I mean, it's a good statement. I think you're right. There probably were a lot of Christians there, but they weren't compelled to go back in the same way that the Jews were, because to them, that's not where eternal life laid anymore. But I'm sure there were Jewish Christians who were in there at the time. But yeah, as far as the disciples go, I think the only one left at that time was John. I think everybody else had been martyred by then. Maybe not. I'm not sure of the exact date. The others were martyred, though, outside of Jerusalem in foreign countries. So, yeah, they were busy doing missionary work, I guess, if they were alive. Any other comments or questions? All right, 9 to 14. And they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. And then many, now remember, it's just the disciples talking to Jesus. This is privately in the Mount of Olives, so he's talking to them. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. All right, so when he's talking about they'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, he's talking to the disciples, and that is exactly what happens to them. They are all murdered except for St. John. They are hated by everybody, Jews and Romans alike. Many will be offended. Many will betray one another. Many will hate one another. That all was going on in Israel at the time. False prophets rising up. Yes, that too was happening. So again, all of these signs are happening in this period between Jesus and the fall of the temple, 70 AD. These are not signs of special things that are going to happen right before Jesus comes. These have been happening the entire time since Jesus spoke them. So they're ongoing signs, but they are not special signs that tell us the end is about to happen. In fact, the last thing of the gospel has got to be preached throughout the world, in all the world. People point to that as proof of, well, we still haven't reached every little corner of the world with the gospel, therefore the end can't come. I'd argue that, in fact, this is the way they saw it already at that time, that they had, by 70 AD, preached the gospel everywhere. And I cite as Acts chapter 2, verse 5, evidence for this. So if you look in Acts 2:5, and this is Peter's sermon at Pentecost. So on Pentecost, Acts 2:5. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And then when the sound occurred, the multitude came together, were confused because everyone heard them speak in their own language. Pentecost is the preaching of the gospel to the world who was gathered there in Jerusalem for the Passover. And from there it spread out, and they took it to all the parts that they came from, the known world. Of course, not the isolated tribe in the middle of Africa. And I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. The known world to them heard the gospel through the apostles. Paul had already brought the gospel to Asia Minor, to Europe by this time. So it was spreading throughout the known world, and I think had been fulfilled then by 70 AD, that the gospel was preached in all the known world as a witness to all the nations. So even that is something that we can say has undoubtedly been fulfilled. Now, the very last asterisk on page 2 going on to page 3 is worth noting. While these signs can be seen throughout history, and all of them prior to 70 AD, one can draw certain lessons from them applicable to the approaching second coming. These things all happened because the people withdrew from God and rejected the gospel. This is what happens every time people withdraw from God and reject the gospel. The more people do so, the more these signs will be manifest. The more godless our world gets, the more we will see these signs. I think today you can see like the sign of love growing cold. You can see that. Our world today is much more unloving than it was a generation ago. People are more self-absorbed. You can see this progression of evil. It's just that this isn't special to our age, this progression of evil. There has always been these evil taking hold and running off, doing all these wicked things Jesus is talking about. Christianity reestablishing and quelling some of that, and then evil running off again as Christianity fades from an area. This has happened throughout history, but you can see it, and it is a principle. The more people pull away from God, the more evil grows. The more lack of love there is in the world, the more lawlessness there is in the world. We see that today too. Not just lawlessness, but judges protecting lawlessness, letting criminals off, going soft on crime. Those are evidences of a world withdrawing from God. They are not necessarily, again, signs that say the end is about to happen right now. We should live every day like the end is about to happen right now. But these signs don't tell us that's going to happen any more than they did 5 generations ago or back in Jesus' day. Second asterisk, page 3. So far, Jesus' answer, aimed at their first question, seeks to keep them from being deceived. His point is that all these things they will see in the world and experience themselves are the norm in a world without God, and they should not look at them as signs of the second coming being imminent. They are so common that they will be readily visible in the world before the events of AD 70. The disciples themselves will see this stuff happening. Let's start verse 15 and stop there for today. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee, etc., etc. We're still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But what is the abomination of desolation? This is one of those things that, again, every author that writes about the second coming who quotes Matthew focuses in on this with some bizarre idea about what the abomination of desolation is. Bottom line is, we don't know exactly. Maybe we can guess. but we don't know exactly. The quote Jesus says, this is from Daniel, as the prophet Daniel said. Unfortunately, his reference to Daniel, which I'm sure he understood crystal clear, because he's the author of all Scripture, we don't. It's a very difficult section. Look in Daniel 11:31 is the citation, and it's part of an overall denunciation of the north and the south, the kingdoms of Israel back in Daniel's day. Verse 31 in Daniel 11, and forces shall be mustered by him, that is the king of the north, I believe, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. That's what Jesus is citing. Now, the biggest thing you can get out of that is the forces shall be mustered by him. So the king of the north musters armies against the king of the south, against Jerusalem, which becomes a symbol for the Roman Empire mustering forces against the Jews. So bottom line is, what was the abomination of desolation in Daniel's day? Don't know. What's the abomination of desolation Jesus talks about? Don't know exactly. But maybe it has something to do with the forces mustering against the kingdom. So a lot of commentators come to the conclusion that the abomination of desolation is in fact the Roman armies that will desecrate the temple, destroy it, cart off its stuff, tramp on holy ground, shed blood in the temple itself. So that seems to be the leading guess most people lean toward. Others suggest that an idol was erected in the temple at that time. There's no evidence that actually happened. Caligula tried it. He wanted to have an idol of himself in the middle of the Jewish temple. The Jews talked him out of it, and then, of course, he was assassinated shortly thereafter, so that wasn't an issue. But various Caesars along the way have wanted their image in the temple. It never happened. So it's not likely to be some kind of idol set up in the temple. There's just no historical evidence of it. So what is it? Don't know, but it was obvious enough that they did know back then. And in 70 AD, the Jews could look and say, there it is. So in all likelihood, it has to do with the Roman armies desecrating the temple. So it's at that time when this happens that the rest of Matthew 24 now is, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop come down, take anything in his house. Let him who's in the field not go back to eat his clothes. And that's the section the millennials just go nuts over, saying this is the end of the world. This is the description of the second coming. And it's not. It's a description of the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, we got to stop there for time's sake. Any closing questions or thoughts? All right, that is where we will pick it up next week. Let's close with prayer. Gracious Lord, we do thank you for the grace you have shown us in protecting us from your enemies that would destroy your church. Build us up today in right faith and love for you above all else. For Jesus' sake, amen.